Welcome to the podcast, Wait, What Do You Do Again? Where we talk to everyday people doing amazing things. I'm your host, Megan DeFord. Let's go. Today we are talking to Heidy De La Cruz, podcast coach, author, and host of the podcast, The American Dream in the Eyes of Immigrants. Heidy, thank you so much for being here today. I am excited to talk about immigration with you and immigrant stories. You are not only a podcaster, but a podcast coach and an author, but you are also the daughter of Dominican parents. Can you tell me a little bit about your family?
Well, thank you, first of all, for providing me this opportunity to come and share about my story, about my parents' story, and then just the work that I'm doing with my podcast. I really appreciate the opportunity and the platform and to share with your audience. And yes, so my parents came in the 90s from the Dominican Republic, and they first immigrated to New York City. And then my dad told me that 3 months after I was born, they decided to move to Michigan. There was more opportunities for jobs there, especially like in the 90s, factories and a lot of jobs in the car industry. So they decided to move there. So I grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And then in 2012 is when I moved to Florida. But growing up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, at first when we were first there wasn't that a lot of like a Dominican community. But as like the years went on, like, one person tells another, and then people slowly start to migrate. So now the Dominican community is a lot larger than what it was when we first were there. And I still have family there. So we still go back to visit Michigan and things like that. But now, like, my dad's immediate family, we're all here in Florida, like spread out. And then even my stepmom's family too, like the majority of us are all here in Florida. But yeah, just growing up, like I remember having to translate a lot for my dad. And then my dad is a mechanic, so we were always going to AutoZone and Advanced Auto Parts and the junkyard, and like just always having to go with him to translate. And I'm like, I don't want to do this because like I was the eldest daughter, and I didn't have an older brother, so it was like me, like I was the one. And then it's funny because finally, when I moved out the house, then it was my little sister who and she would text me like, "Oh, we're at the junkyard." And I was like, "Yep, I already know. I already went through this." So just having to translate a lot, help them, doctor's appointments and things like that when my stepmom was not available. And I would tell him like, English, like you can, and he was like, yes. He was like, I understand them, but a lot of times they don't try to understand me. I was like, oh, okay.
Right.
And so like that really like hit me. And it's like, like he can talk, but obviously he has a very thick accent. And so that was the issue. So yeah, just growing up like that. And then also just culturally, and when immigrants come, they adapt to the American culture and things like that, but they also try to keep certain traditions and stuff. So immigrants are very adaptable. And so, culturally, there were certain things that I couldn't do that my friends could do. And then I remember my best friend used to always like getting upset, like, why aren't you allowed to spend the night? Like, nothing's going to happen. We're going to be, and I'm like, I know. Like, I would like to be able to spend the night, but that's just something that my parents didn't do in the Dominican Republic. And that's not really common. If you're spending a night somewhere, it's usually because you're on vacation or things like that, or there's an emergency, but really that's just not a thing that they do over there. So I remember just like, I was only allowed to spend the night at my grandma's house, and that was it. So, yeah. So just things like that. And yeah, like I remember when my stepmom or my dad, one of them, they were practicing for their citizenship test that they had to take before they get sworn in. And it's you have to study 100 questions. And out of those 100 questions, they're only going to ask you 10, but you don't know which 10 they're going to ask. And you have to study it in English and learn it, right? And so she was like, at the time there were CDs. We remember those CDs.
Yeah.
So she was studying the CD, and like my best friend was in the car with us, and she was like, I don't know the answers to
Yeah.
these questions. Like, what?
Yeah.
So yeah, it was really crazy. And my dad failed a few times because he gets really nervous.
Sure.
And so, like, you know, like his mind would just go blank. And I'm like, Dad, you know this. Like, come on. So eventually he did pass the citizenship test, and then he got sworn in. And I remember going with him to the ceremony, and I was just like so proud, and just like seeing all these different people from all over the world, all these different cultures just coming together, being sworn in to be citizens. And before I moved to Florida, I was just starting out in the corporate world. So I was
Mhm.
just like, had just gotten like my first corporate job. So I wasn't sure like how things worked. And so I remember like I wanted to ask to have that the Friday off so I could go with him. And because I was at college at the time. And then I was really nervous because I was like, oh my God, I just started this new job. I don't know if they're going to let me. But luckily, my supervisor was Indian American. So her parents immigrated from India. And so I was explaining, I was like, yeah, Friday is my dad's citizenship ceremony to get sworn in. And she was like, oh my God, that's so exciting. She was like,
Yeah.
I remember when my parents did it. It was such a, like, she understood
Yeah.
the significance of this ceremony. So she was like, of course you can have Friday. Like, yes, you have to be there. You can't miss it. So like that was just like such a sigh of relief. Like, oh
Yes.
my God, she gets it, you
Gets it.
know?
Yeah.
And yeah, so those are a little bit of things like growing up with immigrant
Yeah.
parents. Yeah.
A friend of mine who's Venezuelan just got her citizenship, and
Oh,
we like ran through the questions
yeah.
and thinking we were going to help her study, and she like knew all of them. And when I was looking at the questions, there were some that I was like, wait, why do I even know this? Like I got the answer right, but I was like, why do I know this?
Yeah.
And then I think I got the law of the land question wrong. I was like, oops. Um,
Oopsies.
but yeah, but it's so interesting is, someone who was born here,
Mm-hmm.
we take it for granted, right? And you have to do it in English, which makes total sense, but as a second language and you're learning all of this history that like
Yes.
it's tougher than you may think. And it's funny, your
Yeah.
friend's like, I don't know these answers.
Yeah, yep, exactly. And just thinking about that test reminds me of like what one of my guests was telling me. He's an attorney now, but when he was studying to do the LSAT before you get into law school, it's a
Mhm.
time test, and like you have like they have it calculated to the T, like how many minutes per question you actually have to be able to
Mhm.
finish it. And I can't remember how much it is, but he was explaining to me how like that is a disadvantage to people who know or whose languages or English is their second language is a
Sure.
disadvantage, because he was like, we're literally translating in our
Yes.
head, and that takes longer than someone who's native born here and
Mhm.
their only language is English. Like they they don't have to translate, like they
Right.
already know. And I was like, I've never thought about that. I was like,
Yeah.
that is so true. I mean, I heard that they're gonna get rid of the LSAT, and they're gonna do another way to for
Oh,
people to get into law school. That's like coming down the pipe. But like just thinking about that, I was like, wow, I never really thought about that. Like, yeah, like they are translating
yeah.
in their minds. And even me sometimes, like I'll know certain words in Spanish and I'm like, I don't know what this is in English, or vice versa. It's like, okay,
Right.
I know it in English, but I was like,
Right.
what is it in Spanish? And that actually happened to me recently. I work remote,
Uh-huh.
and we actually did a trip for work, and everybody went to corporate to headquarters to meet each other for the first time. And so we were playing Pictionary, and the word, I know it now, pendulum, it's the
Oh,
little thing
yes.
from, okay, I didn't know what that was.
Yeah.
So like, I was like, my turn, and I was like, I don't know what this word means.
Right.
I can't draw this. And so someone else had to take my turn. And so then I finally learned like what it was. And I was like, well, I didn't know. I've
Right.
seen it, but I
Right.
didn't know that word. And
Right.
so I was like,
Right.
well, it is what it is.
What a difference it must have been for your dad and stepmom going from the Dominican Republic to Michigan. I mean,
Yeah.
it's one thing to adapt, but that seems like a really big chasm. Like, what are some of the things or
Yeah.
traditions that they were able to keep and incorporate in that felt like home to them?
Yeah, for sure. So definitely, the food. I grew up eating Dominican food. So rice, beans, chicken, plantains, we eat a lot of oatmeal. So just like the food was definitely kept. So like we barely ate out. We
Hmm.
barely ate, like if we did, it was because it was a special occasion.
Hmm.
And always like they always joke around like, oh, there's food at home. Like,
Right.
you don't have to eat out. There's food at home. So yeah, so it was like cooking every single day. Let me see. Obviously, like the music, we always
Hmm.
listen to our music from home, and we always like when they would have cable, they always make sure to get like the Spanish packages so they
Hmm.
could listen to like Spanish channels, or then it expanded to like even get channels from the Dominican Republic. So I think
Hmm.
they were able to like get like two channels from over there, so they were able to continue to like keep up with the news and
Hmm.
things like that. My family is a big sports fan, especially
Uh-huh.
baseball. So we're big Dominicans, are big on
Yeah.
baseball, so I definitely grew up watching baseball, still do.
Yeah.
And so like going to and then traveling a lot. That's not really culture, but yeah, so just the language, food. Christmas for us is we actually celebrate on the 24th, which we
Hmm.
call Noche Buena.
Hmm.
And so we still kept that. So it's this big, literally fancy dinner. So there's just lots of food. You dress up in like what we call, in English, our Sunday best.
Right.
So, you like got to get the best clothes and everything. So makeup done, hair done, and things like that. So yeah, so that's definitely a tradition that we've kept, and then we've definitely adapted to Thanksgiving. So
Hmm.
Thanksgiving is not a thing over there, but as coming to the United States, and we know it's a holiday here, so we definitely adapted. So it's kind of like having two Christmases for us, because it's the
Right.
same, like we do the same thing. We eat the turkey and have a big meal and everything. So we've definitely adapted to the Thanksgiving. And then so Christmas is on the 24th, and then the 25th was just like leftover days and
Yeah.
open your presents and stuff. So
That's so
yeah.
fun. I think Thanksgiving is a holiday that I find so fascinating in with friends whose parents are immigrants or maybe like their
Mm,
grandparents like fairly close
yeah.
because the food is like so much better. It's like they might have a turkey, but then it's like more traditional. And I
Oh
love that. I think
yeah.
it's so cool that, we come together for this holiday that, celebrates food and family and,
Now I'm laughing because it's making me think of like when I hosted Thanksgiving for the first time. Because when we do Thanksgiving, we cook the Dominican food. So
mhm,
we have like the rice with guandules, and then we have plantains and things like that. And obviously we have turkey, but we also have what we call pernil, which is like a pork shoulder, which is very popular in the holidays, and empanadas and stuff like that. So when I hosted Thanksgiving one year, obviously like the host is supposed to do the turkey, but I'm not a big cooker. Like
yeah,
I cook for my family, but I'm like, I'm not going to cook for like 20, 30 people.
right.
So I was like, okay, I was like, we can use my house, but grandma, you still have to cook the turkey and the ham. Like, I'm not
Right.
doing that. So she was like, so what are you going to cook? And I was like, I'll cook baked mac and cheese. And she was like, that doesn't go with our food. I'm like, oh my gosh. I was like, grandma, like, it's okay. Like, we
Yeah.
can like incorporate, a little bit of American food. And
Yeah.
she was like, well, you can make it, but I'm not going to eat it. I'm like, okay, grandma.
Okay,
Okay.
grandma.
Yeah. So that's
That's
what I
really
was
funny.
thinking about. It's just like, yeah, well, we do our holiday stuff. It's just a Dominican food because my
Right.
grandma does not want to do like the
She's not
American.
playing around with other,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
she's
She's like, that
like,
doesn't
no.
go with our food. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Well, in my family, I mean, I actually don't know that much about my ancestry, but I do know we're German. And it's funny
Mm,
because we have sauerkraut at every holiday. And as a kid,
okay.
I thought like everybody did. And it
Yeah,
wasn't until
same.
college that I was like, oh, no one eats sauerkraut at Thanksgiving.
Yep.
So,
I was like, everybody eats rice at Thanksgiving.
yeah.
Like, what? No, no.
Yeah, no, it's not. But I love that. I love that we can incorporate,
Yeah.
we're a country of immigrants, and it's so cool to be able to incorporate
Yes.
in that traditional food. And turkey almost becomes this like, okay, we'll have it, but it's not really,
Yep.
this isn't the main
Exactly.
event. Like,
Yep.
that's great. So, as I mentioned, you're a podcaster and you host the
Yes.
podcast, The American Dream in the Eyes of Immigrants. And I love this. And you're telling immigrant stories.
Yep.
Why did you want to start this podcast and why are these stories important to tell?
Yes, that's a very good question. So, Before we started recording, we were talking about how like we wanted to launch our podcast like years before we actually did. And that's exactly what happened to me too. So it was around 2019. I was a fan of podcasts for years before I actually launched mine. So I would listen. I loved actually interview style podcasts because I love hearing other people's stories. I love learning from other people, their experiences and things like that. And so I was like, okay, I want to start a podcast. And I was like, I am going to interview everyday random people, everyday regular people, and just talk about the good things that God is doing in their life and like the impact that they're having around people around them. Because we don't really celebrate ourselves. So I was like, I want to celebrate regular people. So that's what my podcast initially was going to be. And so 2019, I was finishing my master's program. So I was like, okay, I can't do it now because, all my extra time is going to studying. And so then 2020, when the pandemic happened, I was dealing with a lot of mental health issues. So I was like, okay, obviously this is not the time to launch. 2021, I was pregnant with my son and just was focusing on that pregnancy because it was really hard. So I was like, finally in 2022, I was on maternity leave and I was like, okay, I still want to launch this podcast. I'm done with school. I'm not pregnant. We're on the other side of the pandemic. I'm going to do this. So I was like, I have a little bit of time in my hands and I'll make it work in my schedule. So I literally like Googled like how to start a podcast. So as I'm trying to put this podcast together and start to brainstorm like who am I going to interview? What am I going to talk about? And things like that. I actually run across this article on Medium because I'm also a freelance writer. So I write on Medium as well. And so this article, it was from an immigrant and she came from Kenya and she was talking about cultural shocks that she experienced in the United States. And so she explained the cultural shock and then explained how like it diminished her confidence. And it was like, kind of like, do I belong? Do I not belong? Kind of thing. And it really hit me. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is not talked about. We don't hear about what happens to immigrants once they get to the United States. We always hear, like, unfortunately, immigration is painted in such a negative light in the current season that we're in. And so all we hear is like, they're coming, there's too many people and stealing the jobs and all this other stuff. But we don't ever hear stories of like, what did it actually take to come here? Why did you come? What was the process like? Because the immigration system in our country is very complex and it's not as easy to come as people think it is. So as I was reading the article,
I think people are like, you just show up and you're like, I'm here. Like,
no,
it's not like
all.
that.
And I've interviewed attorneys, right? I've ever interviewed attorneys and immigrants themselves who then become attorneys because of the process, right? They like want to help. So it's just so complex, and we don't hear that. We don't really get the details of that. So as I was reading the article, I then went to my husband because he's also an immigrant. He came when he was 9 from the Dominican Republic as well. So I went to him and I was like, man, I just read this article and I'm telling him about it. And then I was like, do you remember when you came to the US, like how you felt, cultural shocks you experienced? And he was like very vividly, like it's just something that he would just like never forget. And so he's telling me his story. And so I'm listening to him and I was like, okay, that's a podcast episode right there. Like, this is what I'm going to do. I am going to share immigrant stories. And so he was like, yeah, that's a good idea. So then I started to like make a list of like, who can I interview or like ask first, who can I interview and things like that. And like what exactly we were going to talk about. So what we talk about on the podcast is depending on what age they came, like we talk about like their life before coming to the US and how it was. We talk about if they would like to share events that led them to move to the United States. And then we talk about cultural shocks that, they experienced. And then we talk about their business. So like the majority of my guests have all have their own businesses. And so that's, the huge misconceptions that immigrants are coming to steal jobs when in reality, they're creating jobs for themselves. They're launching businesses, and that in itself creates jobs for other people. And we know that America thrives on small businesses, right? And so we talk about that. So then that gives them the chance to, share what they do and how they can, help serve the audience and things like that. And so that's what we talk about. And it's been an amazing 2 years of launching this podcast and listening to all these stories. And people tell me, my guests always tell me that, like, they either been on podcasts before or this is the first time being on a podcast, but this is their first time actually talking about their immigration story, like that part of their story. Because they always tell me, like, no one asked. No one has ever asked them asked them before about their immigration journey. So a lot of them are, very open to share, which I'm really grateful for, because that provides that education for those who don't know. And I've only had one guest pull her whole episode. She was like, I'm actually not comfortable sharing it now. And I was like, okay, that's perfectly fine. I can't force anyone to share their story. And because of the different reasons why people come, like, I want them to be comfortable with what they're sharing and not feel like they have to share just for share. I was like, no, you're like, when you're ready to share, then, we can definitely do that. So that's how that got started. I was also thinking just about, like, my parents' experience and my experience growing up with immigrant parents, because as a child of immigrants, we have a different experience than children whose parents are native born here. And so I started also interviewing children of immigrants and sharing their experience and things like that. And so I realized, like, we have a lot more in common than what we do that we're different. But it's been such an incredible journey. It just makes me feel like so blessed to live in a place where we literally have the whole world in our backyard. So culturally diverse. And then also, depending on where they live in the United States, like, their experience is so different from, like, other people's experience. So there's some guests who grew up in a very diverse place and they thought that the whole United States was very diverse until they went to college and it was full of white people, and they're like, where are other people, And then you had other people who grew up being the only person of color. Right. And so until they grow up and then they realize, like, oh my gosh, there are other cities and places that are more diverse. And so, like, you get all types of experiences in this podcast. So it's been an amazing journey.
We were talking a little bit earlier about how the immigrant community and the immigrant experience is not a monolith. Like, everybody has a different experience.
Yes.
But have you found any threads that in your conversations that people point to of commonalities that they've experienced?
Yeah. So obviously the homesickness, just like that, trying to adapt. And, like, usually, like, that first year is the hardest, just adapting and missing home and things like that. And then the common thread with at least the children of immigrants is the whole identity. Like, do I identify as American? Do I identify as, the country from my parents are from? And just having that tug of back and forth. So, like, for me, for example, I was too Dominican for my American friends. And then, like, for my family, it's like, oh my God, you're so American, Or, like, when we would go visit back to the Dominican Republic, it was like, oh, now you guys are Americanized. Like, now we are, not Dominican, right? And so just that whole identity thing and back and forth, like, that is very, very common. And then also, like, for immigrants themselves, like I said earlier, like, they're very adaptable, but depending on where they land, like, a lot of people won't be welcoming. So it's like they feel like they have to prove themselves more. Like, I belong here, I am American, and things like that. So that's very, very common in the immigration community.
Yeah, you're really caught in between
Yes.
two worlds, but no world at the same time. I'm curious, what did your family in the Dominican, when they said, oh, you guys are Americanized now, or, oh, you're so American, what sort of things were they referring to that they saw that they identified as, like, being quote unquote American?
Just the fact that we lived in the United States.
Just,
that's
well,
it.
Yeah,
that's it. Because it's crazy, because they say that, like, they can tell when Dominicans they're Dominicans that live in the state versus Dominicans that live in the homeland. Like they
Hmm.
can just tell. But just the simple fact that you were living in the United States or born in the United States, they're like, oh no, you're not Dominican.
Anymore.
So
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
example, we went for Christmas this past year, and we were at a resort, and I was getting my nails done. And so she was like, oh, the lady was asking me like, oh, where do I live? And I was like, oh, I live in Florida. And then she was like, no, but where did you learn Spanish? Like, your Spanish is really good. And then I was like, oh, my parents were born in the Dominican Republic. So I grew up speaking Spanish first and then English at school. And so then she was like, oh, okay, yeah, you're American. Like, so like I spoke good Spanish for being American.
American. Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm like, I feel not, I don't want to say I feel more Dominican than American, but I really do, because both of my parents, immigrated, and my stepmom. So it's like
Hmm.
I grew up with more Dominican culture than American. But then, like, now that I'm older and I'm raising my own family, I feel like we're more Americanized than what my parents were. So I
Hmm.
feel like as the generations go, like we get a little bit further away from our roots. And it's sad, but then it's also understandable because of where we live, right? So
Yeah.
like, for example, like my daughter right now, she goes to visit the Dominican Republic for with her dad in the summertime. So she goes to visit
Hmm.
him. So she speaks Spanish out there because, that's what they speak. And her
Yeah.
grandma doesn't know English. But like here, she doesn't want to speak Spanish. And I'm like, you got to speak Spanish because that's our language,
Right.
And she's like, oh, but you know English. Why do I have to speak Spanish to you? You know English.
Right.
So I'm just like trying to like have her understand of the importance of knowing both languages. But it's just like, the generations, as we go further along, the further away we actually get from our cultural roots.
Right. Vice President Harris, who's running for president, it's come up in the public discourse, or at least parts of the discourse, about her parents being immigrants, and is she really American? Like, and almost questioning her citizenship,
Yeah.
which to me was pretty shocking. But from what you're saying, it's sounding like that's probably pretty common with children of
Yeah.
immigrants. Like, well,
Unfortunately.
what I'm hearing is if you keep those traditions, it's like, oh, why don't you like the US? If you
Yeah.
embrace US traditions, it's like, why aren't you keeping your heritage? It feels like an impossible situation to be
It
in.
is. It really, like, children of immigrants, it is. It's like we live in that in between. And it's for her, she has it from both sides, right? Because her
Hmm.
mom came from India and then her
Hmm.
dad came from Jamaica. So it's like, I believe she grew up with her mom. So she grew up with a lot of Indian tradition and culture, but
Hmm.
that doesn't make her any less Jamaican,
Jamaican, right,
right? And
right.
so, like, for me, it's different because both of my parents were Dominican,
Hmm.
but like, there's a lot of people who are mixed,
Hmm.
and that is going to be more common than not,
Yes.
just because of the diverse of this country. Like, this is where we're going.
Yeah.
And yeah, this is where we're going. So I'm just thinking about a writer friend that I have online, and how she created a post recently because of that, because of the whole back and forth. And her mom is Korean
Hmm.
and her father's African American.
Hmm.
And she's like, I'm both and. Why can't
Yeah.
I be both and? What is
Yeah.
the issue? She was like, I have my Korean traditions and I also have my African American traditions. Like,
Right.
we mix them both. There's nothing wrong with that. And if anything, I just find that even more beautiful,
Hmm.
because that's um what people need to understand is the diversity of this country is what's so beautiful. Because all these conversations that we're having, it's only happening here in the United States, because there's no other country that is as
Right.
diverse as this country.
Yeah.
Like, you go to the Dominican Republic and it's like, what are you, Dominican? Like, no
Yeah.
one's gonna
Right.
question that you're Dominican. You go
You
to Jamaica.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, you
like,
physically see it at the Olympics. Like you can find the
oh my
American
God,
team
yes.
because, and it's awesome, but it's like
Yeah.
the American team doesn't look like anything except they're diverse. And you're like,
Yeah.
yes, that's us.
Yep, exactly. So like, yeah, when I saw the picture of the gymnastics team, like,
Yes.
just to have the diversity of it, and it was like, yes, that is so beautiful. Like, you don't get that in any other country. Like, again, like I said, like, you go to Jamaica, everybody's gonna be like, okay, you're Jamaican. Like, no one's going to question you. So it's like,
Right.
why are we questioning our mix people here. Like,
Right.
oh, it's like, okay, where are you from? Oh, okay, that's great. Like, why does that matter? Like, just let them live. Like, let them, like,
Yeah.
because we're already having our identity like internally, right? Like, we're already dealing with that. And
Right.
now it's just even more in heightened,
Yeah.
and everyone's talking about it. And it's just like all human beings, like, we just want to belong.
Of
That's
course.
it. Everyone just
Yeah.
wants to belong.
Yeah. That sense of belonging is so
Yeah.
important. And I think diversity is strength. I think it's what actually makes us great. And while it may not have been something that you wanted to do, translating from a young age, you speak two languages, you lived between these two worlds and have a totally different perspective. And it makes you a stronger person and it helps you connect, in a different sort of way to people, maybe more quickly than others. I think it's funny that going to AutoZone and things like that, I was like,
Yeah.
your
Oh my gosh.
vocabulary was probably totally different.
Yes.
I was like,
Now that you bring that up again, like, my husband actually had to go to what was it, a hardware store, and it was one that I used to go to with my dad. And then like we were like, going through aisles because he was looking for something, and then like I could literally like feel like getting annoyed, like, okay, I
yes.
want to get out of here, I want to get out of here. And then it wasn't until like later I was like, wait, why did I get annoyed in the store? And then I was like, I think it was because my dad used to take me all the time and I just
Yeah.
didn't want to.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just experiences that we as children of immigrants have that just other children of immigrants would understand and go through them themselves. Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any stories that stand out for you?
Oh man, there's so many, especially the ones that I've interviewed a few guests who were undocumented and were eventually able to get their citizenship. And one in particular that really stands out was she came to the US through the border. Her mom actually sent for her. So what happened was she grew up, her mom was in Mexico, her parents were together, and so they were actually high class in Mexico. But after the divorce, the dad, was still making his money, but then her mom became, lower class. So her status of living changed after the divorce.
Mhm.
And so her mom felt that moving to the United States, the land of opportunity, would be better. It's like a better struggle in the US than struggle in Mexico, right? So her mom actually left her and her brother in Mexico while she went to go get settled in the US. Once she was finally able to get settled here, she sent for them. So she was 5, her brother was 7.
Mhm.
And so they came through the border, but she told me that they had to separate them at the border.
Oh my
So
gosh.
yes, so she's 5 crossing by herself, he's 7 crossing by himself. And so they were, in God, they were able to cross, and then they were brought back together in Arizona. And then the mom came in and got them in Arizona. So she was able to, so she was undocumented, and then the DACA came in, so she was able to do that. And then she got petitioned by her stepfather. But since she came through the border, she needed to have a lawful entry to be able to finish the process.
Okay.
So she had to go back to Mexico, and she actually got stuck in Mexico because it was during Thanksgiving season. So
Mhm.
the embassy closed. So she was like, stuck there until the embassy closed. But then also in the back of her mind, there was also that fear that she might not be able to get back in. Like, that's
Right.
the risk, right? You risking going to get the lawful entry, but they can decide not to let you back in. So I was like, how are you feeling? She was like, no, I'm very quick on my feet. So I was already like, okay, I speak English, I speak Spanish, I can do this. I could do, like, she was already
Right.
like making plans. Luckily, she was able to come back in and she finished everything. So she was able to get her permanent residency and then eventually her citizenship. So she's now an immigration attorney. But that story really stuck to me because I'm a mother
Mhm.
and I'm a mother of 2. And so I'm just, putting myself in her mom's shoes as to like, I felt that sending my kids through this, dangerous path is worth the risk
Yeah.
of coming to the United States. And these are the type of stories that I want to share, right? And these are the type of stories that I want people to listen to, because it's like we have to be able to put ourselves in other people's shoes and just think about that. Like, really no one wants to leave their country. No one
Mhm.
wants to leave their culture. No one wants to leave their language, their family. It's just, unfortunate circumstances that leave people to make these desperate decisions that they at their core feel is worth it and it's better than the situation they're living in at home.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that we are able to provide a better living opportunity for them. And actually, it may not even be a better like they may be struggling more here in the US than what they were back home, but they still feel that it's better here
Right.
than, their situation back home. So that story always really sticks out to me.
Yeah. I truly can't imagine. And I have kids too. And you think about what must have been going through her mother's head and heart, making that decision.
Yeah.
Um, I have someone I worked for, one of the best supervisors I ever had, and her mom came to the United States before she and her siblings came. I think about her mom all the time of like she was here alone. She had to build a life here. She sent all the money she could back for her kids, and then she
Yeah.
brought them over. And really, it wasn't about her having a better life. It was for them to have a better life.
Yes.
And it's funny because actually she started a business too. So it's but
See?
but I mean, it's just I think about her a lot with my kids of like you didn't know what
Yeah.
time they went to bed. Like it's those
Yeah.
little things that they're sacrificing, and it's bravery and courage, and it's scary. I mean,
Yeah. And that's another, you just reminded me of another good
mhm,
point of like when the parents make the sacrifice for their kids. And so then the kids have like this guilt of like, I need
mm, yeah,
to make it worth it that for my parents' sacrifice.
hmm,
So like there's that guilt too, that either children that come when they're the parents bring them when they're young,
hmm,
or children of immigrants, it's like, okay, my parents made the sacrifice to come to this country, I need to make sure I make it to make it worth their sacrifice.
yeah,
Because a lot of times, yes, it is families that comes and it is the parents making the choice for their kids. Because as
well,
mothers,
yeah,
we will do anything possible to have security and safety and make sure that our kids are safe. Because once
right,
you become a parent, it's not about us anymore. It's about them.
absolutely. Now, shifting gears a little bit, you are also a podcasting coach. Can you tell me
Yeah.
how you got into that and what are your services? How do you
Yeah.
help people with that?
Yes. So about, I want to say like a year or a year and a half into the podcasting journey. I'm in a lot of Facebook podcast groups, and a lot of people ask questions and things like that. And then other podcasters help, and it's a very supportive community. But one thing that I did see in common was like people wanting to start a podcast and they're like, I don't know where to start, or they're trying to start a podcast and they're overwhelmed with everything and they're like, okay, I need to do this and this and this and this, but what do I do first,
Right.
or they try to do everything at once and it just becomes too much. So I saw that a lot, and so I was like, I did it on my own. I Googled, I figured it out and just put it together. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to learn as I go.
Mhm.
It's better to start and learn from your mistakes and everything than to like not do it at all. But not everyone's like me.
Mhm.
Not everyone is able to just like, figure it out and put it together. So I was like, I want to be that person to help them guide and help them and hold their hands through this process, for those that need it. Like I want to be that help. So because I also believe that people's stories matter, and I also
Mhm.
believe that people we have the ability here in the United States to share our opinions and things like that. So I was like, people's stories matter. If you want to start a podcast and it's put in your heart, it's for a reason. So I was like,
Mhm.
I want to be that person to help them. So that's how that got started. So I help people launch.
Mhm.
So it's I have a 6-week program where I walk through them step by step through those 6 weeks. So we start from everything from starting with your why, setting goals for your podcast, setting your mission and your vision, and then kind of like outlining and brainstorming what you want to talk about and organizing all of that, to then picking a hosting site, to learning how to record, equipment, editing, and then how we're going to market, and things like that. So like 6 weeks, each week we'll work like on a different step, and they kind of build on each other. So week one builds on week two, and week 3 to 4, and things like that. So it's a 6 week program. There's two options. They can either hire me directly, so then I'll sit with them on a one-on-one call on a weekly basis, or I have a course, an online course that goes through like, you have a video for week one, a video for week two. The videos are like about 10 to 15 minutes long. They're not that long because again, I wanted to keep this as simple as possible, and I didn't want it to be overwhelming like that, because I don't want people to like not launch their podcast because it's overwhelming. Like, no, we're going to make this simple, to the point. It's going to be great. So those are the two options, actually three. Sorry, I also have an ebook. So if they don't want to do hire me directly and they can't do the course, there's an ebook that again will walk you through step by step on how to launch. Walks you through everything, talk about the podcast hosting, the equipment, editing, all of that good stuff. So those are the different ways that people can hire me. So I help them with the launch. So help them organize like their first 6 episodes right off the bat, or if depending if they want to do seasons or things like that, because we know how flexibility podcast has, so you can make it your own and really what works for your schedule. And so so I started that because I was like, I really want to help people launch their podcast, because I guess I to be like that person that I didn't have, when I started, because when I started my podcast, I was like, I don't know like any friends or family who's doing this. So I'm just out here on my own, like winging it. So I was like, but I can help people with this. So that's how I got started. I've helped a few people already, and I truly enjoy the process of like getting their ideas and just like step by step, like putting it all together and just having it, out to the world. And so, so that's how that got started. That's what I do. And I also have started providing editing services, which just like came to me. Like it wasn't even something I planned for, but I really enjoyed it. I was like, man, I actually like putting the intro and then, and then putting the outro and then like the transitions and then like listening to like the whole thing at the end. And I'm like, I did that. Like, okay. So I've dived into a little bit of editing. And so I'm like, if God wants, this to expand, then he'll make it work. But so launching and editing right now are the services that I provide. And if anybody has any questions, I'm always willing to help and provide answers. And if I don't know answers, then I'll help and find, but I don't believe in gatekeeping. I'm an open book and things like that. So I started also doing a free monthly masterclass, like how to launch a podcast masterclass, where people sign up when they're interested in launching a podcast. And then I give them all the behind the scenes work that it takes to launch it, because I want people to know what they're getting into before they start. I mean, as you know, as a podcaster yourself, like it's fun to stay here and record, but there's like a lot of things that goes on behind the scenes. So very open in the masterclass, I answer as much questions as I can. And I let them know like, hey, you need a schedule, you need to record, you need to edit, you need to find music, you need, equipment and things like that. And just provide as much information as I can so they know what podcasting actually takes. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's funny sitting here and I can see you, our listeners can't, and you're so excited about it. It's palpable. But what I'm realizing is you're still translating. You're like translating this process for people, like you're still doing it. It's like you're such a natural.
I didn't realize that. Yeah,
you're like right. Such a natural at it. That's amazing. I asked 3 questions of everyone. And the first one is, what advice would you give to your younger self? Knowing what you know now, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Oh my God. You're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. You're going to go through some challenges. You're going to go, through some hardships, and you're going to figure out who you are. You will.
What do you love most about whether it's podcasting or writing or coaching? What do you love most?
So what I love most about podcasting is honestly the connection that I'm making with people. Like, having the opportunity to be on other podcasts like I am right now, but then also just speaking to people from literally all over the world.
Mhm.
I'm learning so much history. I'm learning so much culture. I'm learning so much from people's stories. And there was this one guest where I just looked at her and I was like, you have lived an incredible life. Like I was just such in awe of like her life. So I love that. I love learning and I love sharing these stories. In regards to coaching, I just love the whole process of
Mhm.
just like, from start to finish and just seeing everything slowly come together. And my most recent client, she was like, 'cause I was telling her when I was like, when you start recording, it's going to take a little bit. Like, you're going to have to
Mhm.
practice. You're going to, take a few times. It's okay. And so I was explaining this all to her. And so the next call we get on, and she was like, Heidi, you know what you're doing. You know
Yeah.
what you're talking about. Because that's exactly what happened. Like, I had to stop and record again and pause. And I was like, I told you, it just
Yeah.
takes practice, And so writing for me is an outlet. So
Mhm.
it's just how I can able to get my thoughts and my feelings. Very therapeutic for me. So that's what I really love about that.
Amazing. You are a very busy person.
I
You've got so
am.
much going on and so creative. That's amazing. So how can people find you?
Yes, so I am on Instagram and Threads. I love hanging out on Threads. And I'm also on YouTube, or my podcast is on YouTube.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, mostly Instagram. So my handle there is my name. It's Heidy,
Mhm.
period, De La Cruz. So DELACRUZ
Mhm.
13.
Awesome.
Mhm.
And we'll have all that information up with your bio on the website so people can find you and hire you and listen to you
Well,
and read you.
I didn't press yes. And my website, duh, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. You can find out more of my services on my website, HeidiDelacruz.com. Sure.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And Heidi with a Y. Heidi, this has been such a pleasure. Any final thoughts?
Whatever it is that you want to do, whether it's a podcast, whether it's writing a book, anything that is in your heart that you want to do and you're holding yourself back, I just say go for it. You learn from making mistakes. You're not gonna know right off the bat, but just go for it, because it's better to try things and figure out that you didn't really like them than to live with the what ifs.
Hmm.
And if it's something that you really, really want to start, then reach out to someone who's doing it. So, you want to start a podcast, can reach out to me,
Hmm.
another podcaster, ask questions. You want to write a book, reach out to an author and things like that, just to ask questions and stuff. But definitely put yourself out there and do it. It's so
Yeah.
much better when you put yourself out there.
Yeah. And I've constantly been shocked throughout my whole life. And I don't know why I'm shocked because I feel this way. People are happy to help. Like
Yes.
it is, I can't even think of a time when someone was like, no. Like sometimes people are like, I'm not the right person, but let me get you to the right
Yes.
person. And
And people feel honored actually when you ask them, like,
yeah,
oh, you want to learn from me? Like,
yeah,
you think I'm worthy of being asked? Like,
yeah,
So yes, people are definitely willing to help. And like I said, if they don't know the answer, they most likely will know someone who can help you.
yeah, absolutely. That's great. That's wonderful advice. Thank you again so much. I'm coming to your Thanksgiving this year. And hopefully grandma will try my food. But thank you so much. This
Thank
was
you.
really great and such a wonderful conversation and a timely conversation as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Wait, What Do You Do Again? For more information about today's guest, or if you'd like to be on the show, please visit megdeford.com. See you next time.